Have you ever imagined that one man's fall could be so heavy, so cursed, so bound by shadows, that even the man who sentenced him would vanish into the same darkness? Because this isn't just a story about a dictator. This is a story about fear, power, silence, and the echo of decisions that outlive the people who make them. Because Saddam Hussein was not just a leader. He was a living regime, a system carved into the skin of a nation, a breathing embodiment of fear, a man whose name was enough to make rooms go quiet, whose portrait watched over Iraq like a god of vengeance, whose voice, even in silence, crushed dissent, and when he rose through the ranks of the Ba'ath party, eliminating his rivals not with debates but with bullets, not with votes but with midnight disappearances, people understood that Iraq was no longer a country. It was a mirror of his rage, his vision, and his paranoia, and yet strangely, he built schools, paved roads, electrified villages, empowered women, and gave the illusion of progress while building a prison without bars, and people, trapped in the paradox, whispered, "At least the country is standing," as they buried neighbors, erased memories, and painted over bloodstains with concrete, because Saddam did not just silence opposition. He reshaped what it meant to exist, to speak, to trust, and yet even all that wasn't his final madness, because there was something darker, something unholy, something mythological in what came next. The blood. Quran, where he drained his own veins, let liters of his own blood flow into jars, turned into ink by careful chemists, and handed to a calligrapher to write the Quran from start to finish, a book written not in reverence but in ego, not in worship but in the belief that he was chosen, and the world reacted, horrified, stunned, outraged. Scholars condemned it, imams wept, but Saddam didn't care because in his mind, he wasn't just a man, he was a symbol, perhaps a prophet of power, perhaps a demon of control. And then came 2003, when the United States, armed with accusations of weapons of mass destruction, descended upon Iraq with fire and steel, tearing apart the cities Saddam built, collapsing his army, his palaces, his statues, until there was nothing left but whispers and smoke. And Saddam vanished, as if the ground itself had opened and swallowed him, leaving even his enemies confused. Until one day, in a hole in the earth, beneath a shack in Tikrit, they found him, dirty, exhausted, hair wild, beard grown, but his eyes, oh his eyes, they were still burning, still defiant, still daring the world to look away. And when he stood in court months later, cameras flashing, world watching, he did not bow his head, he did not apologize, he did not flinch. He said, "I am Saddam Hussein," as if the name alone should stop time, and perhaps it did, because the silence that followed was thicker than any wall. And the man who would pass the final judgment was Judge Rauf Abdul Rahman, a Kurdish man whose people had suffered under Saddam's regime, and maybe this was justice, maybe it was revenge, maybe both. But Rauf stood firm, declared the verdict, signed the paper, and Saddam was sentenced to hang. And the world watched as he was led to the gallows, the footage leaking, grainy, haunting, unforgettable. But the story didn't end with Saddam's lifeless body swaying in the dark. No, because the man who had read the verdict, the man who stood tall in court, the man who said, "Justice is done," he vanished, just like Saddam had before him. First it was rumors, threats, whispers, then silence, and in 2014, a politician said he had been killed by militants, but there was no body, no grave, no proof, just a cold, hollow silence that felt eerily familiar, as if Saddam had reached out from the grave and pulled him into the same fate. And now, years later, no one knows the truth. Was he assassinated? Was he protected? Did he change his name and flee to Europe? Does he walk among crowds unnoticed, or was he buried in an unmarked grave, forgotten by the world he once served? No one can say, because in this story there is no hero, there is no villain, only shadows, only silence, only the haunting realization that when a dictator dies, his curse may live on. And perhaps the cost of delivering justice to a man like Saddam Hussein is not fame, not glory, not peace, but disappearance, because justice, when entangled with fear and power, becomes something else entirely, something that doesn't end in a courtroom or at the gallows, but lingers, whispers, infects, and consumes the very soul that tried to control it. There are men who rule countries, there are men who destroy them, but then there are those rare, chilling exceptions, the men who become the country, who infect its soil, its people, its language, its silence. And Saddam Hussein was one of those men, a figure whose name didn't just spark fear, it triggered something deeper. A tremor in the soul, a question in the mind, a hesitation in the breath, because he wasn't just feared for his actions, but for what he represented. Control, totality, punishment without warning, and power without mercy. And as his regime grew thicker, bloodier, and more theatrical, his mind seemed to dive deeper into something spiritual, or perhaps sacrilegious, as if he began to believe he was more than a man, more than a leader, more than a dictator, and that belief became terrifyingly real when the world learned of what he had done. He had ordered the Quran, the holiest book in Islam, to be written with his own blood, not metaphorically, but literally, drawing gallons from his body over the span of 2 years, handing it to artists and chemists who turned it into ink, staining the pages of sacred scripture with the essence of tyranny. And this wasn't about religion. This was about legacy, about cementing his myth, about proving to the world and to himself that he wasn't bound by man or God, and in doing so, he crossed a line that not even his most brutal acts had touched, because this was no longer political. It was metaphysical, existential, cosmic in arrogance, and while scholars across the Islamic world condemned it as blasphemy, as madness, some whispered that Saddam was involved in something older than religion, something buried in the sands of Mesopotamia. Some whispered about the Sun Order, a secret esoteric cult said to trace its roots back to Babylon. And while nothing was ever proven, the symbolism of Saddam's blood-stained Quran, his obsession with ancient symbols, his fondness for palace architecture that mirrored ziggurats and temples, all added to the theory that this man no longer saw himself as mortal. He was trying to ascend into something untouchable, and the irony was that his greatest enemy, the United States, had once been his ally, had once armed him, supported him, encouraged his strength during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, seeing him as a buffer against Iranian expansion. And during that time Saddam received intelligence, weapons components, and silent nods from the West. Until, of course, he invaded Kuwait in 1990, crossing a red line that turned the same hands that fed him into fists that struck him. And after the Gulf War ended, sanctions crushed Iraq's economy, but Saddam endured, his grip tighter than ever, his propaganda louder, his surveillance deeper, and his paranoia worse. And yet, in the midst of all this, the United States never stopped seeing him as a problem to be removed. And Saddam knew this. He saw the shifting tides, the smiles that turned to daggers, and when the second invasion came in 2003, when the weapons of mass destruction became the excuse, Saddam vanished not out of fear, but out of strategy, as if he knew the myth must not end with a bullet in the street, but in something more haunting. And when he was found, buried in a hole in Tikrit, the man who once ruled millions now looked like a ghost. But when his eyes locked with the camera, people didn't see defeat. They saw defiance, like a man who had planned it all, like a man who knew that his end was only the beginning of something worse. And in those final months before his trial, his silence was louder than speeches, his beard thicker than the lies told about him, and the world watched with morbid fascination as Saddam Hussein, the monster, the legend, the symbol, stood in a courtroom surrounded by enemies, unrepentant, unmoved. And when he was sentenced, when the rope was prepared and the trapdoor opened, something shifted. Something ancient seemed to close a chapter not only on him but on the world that created him. They thought it ended the moment his body dropped, when the noose tightened, when Saddam Hussein exhaled his last breath surrounded by men who hated him. But they were wrong, so wrong, because some stories don't end with a body. They begin there. And in this one, the most terrifying twist didn't come from Saddam's life or death, but from what happened to the man who sentenced him, Judge Rauf Abdul Rahman, a man who stood in front of history, who faced the unblinking eyes of a monster and said, "You are guilty," believing perhaps that this would bring justice, that this would close the wound, that this would finally end the nightmare that Iraq had endured. But the nightmare didn't end. It shifted, it turned, it consumed him, because shortly after Saddam was hanged, the judge who ordered it vanished, first slowly, quietly, no public appearances, then came whispers, death threats, foreign protection, fear, then complete silence. And the silence screamed louder than any explosion. Because no one knew where he was, no government confirmed his status, no media could find him. And in 2014, a politician from Iraq claimed he had been kidnapped by militants and executed in cold blood. But there was no proof, no grave, no funeral, no closure, only a chilling question mark where a man used to be. And some believe he's still alive, living under a false identity in Europe, protected by shadows, perhaps even by the same governments that once applauded his verdict. But others believe he was taken, punished not by law, but by vengeance, as if Saddam's spirit reached out from the grave and dragged the judge with him, as if judgment itself became cursed. Because how can justice exist in a world where the one who enforces it disappears without a trace? And what does that say about our systems, our governments, our illusions of order, if even the judge becomes a ghost? And perhaps the real message here, the one that no one wants to hear, is that power, once wielded with cruelty, never truly dies. It lingers, it infects, it waits, and Saddam may be dead, buried, rotting in some forgotten grave, but the fear he created, the darkness he spread, still lives on in missing men, in unanswered questions, in nations that still struggle to heal. And maybe, just maybe, that is the real horror. Not the man himself, but the curse he left behind, a curse that devoured the one person who dared to hold him accountable. Because in the end, what is justice without protection? What is a verdict without safety? What is a final sentence if it echoes back and silences the one who spoke it? And now, years later, the courtroom is gone, the cameras are off, but the story remains. Two men, one executed, one vanished, and a question that still chills the soul. Was Saddam's ghost more powerful than Saddam himself?